August 15, 1945. The crackling voice of Emperor Hirohito filtered through radio speakers across the Japanese Empire, speaking words that had never been uttered by a divine ruler in the 2,600-year history of Japan. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. In a prisoner of war camp outside Killeen, Texas, 217 Japanese soldiers stood in rigid formation under the brutal summer sun, listening to their emperor's surrender announcement. But something else competed for their attention that morning. Drifting across the dusty compound came a smell unlike anything they had encountered in their months of captivity. Sweet, smoky, rich with the scent of burning oak wood and sizzling meat. The Americans were preparing something called barbecue. 26-year-old Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood at the front of the formation, his back perfectly straight despite the oppressive heat. He had been captured 6 months earlier on Okinawa, pulled from a collapsed bunker, more dead than alive. The shame of survival had haunted him every day since. Now, hearing his emperor's voice admitting defeat, he felt the last remnants of his world crumbling. Everything he had believed in, everything he had been willing to die for, had been revealed as insufficient. They had lost. He was a prisoner. And somewhere beyond the wire fence, Americans were cooking meat and laughing. Private First Class Robert Martinez watched the Japanese prisoners from his post near the camp's main gate. The 22-year-old from San Antonio had seen combat in the Philippines before being reassigned to guard duty after taking shrapnel in his left leg. He understood what these men were feeling, even if they had been enemies just months before. Defeat tasted bitter no matter which uniform you wore. His commanding officer, Captain James Mitchell, had given unusual orders for the day. Instead of the standard evening meal distribution, the guards were preparing a traditional Texas barbecue. Brisket had been smoking since before dawn. Ribs glistened on the massive iron grill that Martinez's uncle had helped construct. Potato salad sat in enormous bowls, and corn on the cob waited to be thrown on the fire. It seemed almost obscene to be celebrating on the day when these Japanese soldiers had just heard their emperor surrender, but Captain Mitchell had been clear about his reasoning. They need to know that the war is over, he had told his men that morning. They need to understand that we're not going to treat them the way they might have treated us. We're Americans, and Americans know that even enemies deserve dignity once the fighting stops. Martinez watched as the Japanese formation finally broke apart, the soldiers moving slowly back toward their barracks. Their faces showed no emotion, but their eyes kept drifting toward the source of that intoxicating smell drifting across the camp. The Japanese prisoners had arrived at Camp Hood 3 months earlier, in May of 1945, transported from California in sealed railway cars that smelled of sweat, fear, and disinfectant. Takeshi remembered every moment of that journey. The darkness of the train car, broken only by thin slats of light. The silence among the men, each lost in his own thoughts about dishonor and survival. The shame that sat heavier than the metal chains they wore around their wrists. They had been taught from childhood that capture was worse than death, that a true soldier of the emperor would never allow himself to fall into enemy hands. Yet here they were, living proof of their own failure. When the train doors finally opened in Texas, the heat had struck them like a physical blow. It was different from the humid warmth of the Pacific Islands where most had fought. This was a dry, relentless heat that seemed to pull moisture from the very air. But what surprised them more than the temperature was the lack of brutality. American guards had removed their chains and led them into a compound that, while clearly a prison, bore little resemblance to the horror stories they had been told about Allied treatment of prisoners. There were barracks with real beds, a mess hall, even a small area for recreation, no torture chambers, no execution walls, just rows of simple wooden buildings surrounded by wire fence and guard towers. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, a 34-year-old career soldier from Osaka, had been the first to voice what many were thinking. "This is a trick," he had whispered to Takeshi that first night. "They want us to relax, to let our guard down. Then they will show their true nature." But weeks had passed, then months, and the expected cruelty never materialized. The American guards were professional but not cruel. They provided adequate food, medical care for the wounded, and even allowed the prisoners to maintain their own internal command structure. It was deeply confusing. The meals had been the strangest part of the adjustment. American military rations were nothing like Japanese food. Everything was oversized, over-seasoned, and oddly textured. Bread that was somehow both soft and sweet. Meat in quantities that seemed wasteful. Vegetables cooked until they lost all structure. The Japanese prisoners ate what they were given, but without pleasure or understanding. Food was fuel, nothing more. They had been soldiers too long to expect joy from eating, but today, on this day of ultimate defeat, something different was happening in the American section of the camp. That smell continued to drift across the compound, growing stronger as the afternoon progressed. Rich and complex, it carried notes of smoke, char, and something sweet that none of the Japanese prisoners could identify. Some tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the implications of the emperor's announcement. Others found their attention repeatedly drawn toward the source, their stomachs responding to signals their minds tried to suppress. The Japanese prisoners had established their own rigid society within the camp's wire boundaries, a miniature reflection of the military hierarchy they had known before capture. Takeshi, as the highest-ranking officer among them, bore the weight of maintaining discipline and morale among men who had lost everything except their sense of duty. Each morning began with formation at precisely 6 o'clock, the prisoners standing in perfect rows as they had done in the Imperial Army. They bowed toward the east, toward Japan, toward an emperor who remained divine in their hearts despite the circumstances that had brought them here. They maintained their uniforms as best they could, mending tears and washing away the Texas dust that settled on everything. Meals were consumed in silence, the men sitting in rank order, the most senior eating first. It was a small thing, this preservation of protocol, but it was all they had left. When American guards walked past during these formal meals, they often shook their heads in bemused confusion. The cultural gap between captors and captives seemed unbridgeable. The Americans ate casually, laughing and joking even during official duties. They slouched in their chairs, called their officers by first names when off duty, and treated military protocols as suggestions rather than sacred obligations. To the Japanese prisoners, this informality seemed almost obscene. How could an army function without rigid discipline? How could men respect authority if it was so casually exercised? Yet these same informal, undisciplined Americans had won the war. This contradiction gnawed at Takeshi during the long, hot Texas nights. He lay on his bunk, listening to the breathing of his fellow prisoners, and tried to reconcile what he had been taught with what he had witnessed. The Americans had crushed the Imperial Army with their industry, their technology, and their seemingly endless resources. They had done it while maintaining a casualness that would have resulted in courts-martial in the Japanese military. Private Kenji Sato, a 19-year-old from a farming village outside Hiroshima, had once asked Takeshi a dangerous question. "Lieutenant, if discipline and honor were supposed to make us strong, why did we lose to men who seem to have neither?" Takeshi had reprimanded him for the question, but privately, he had no answer. Now, on this afternoon of surrender, that question seemed more relevant than ever. The smell of cooking meat continued to drift across the compound, and with it came the sound of American laughter. The guards were gathering near the large grills, their voices carrying across the distance. They were celebrating, clearly, though their celebration seemed more focused on fellowship than on victory. No one was mocking the Japanese prisoners. No one was engaged in triumphant displays of dominance. They were simply cooking food and enjoying each other's company, as if the greatest war in human history had been nothing more than an unfortunate interruption to normal life. Takeshi watched from the window of his barracks, his hands clasped behind his back, his face carefully neutral. But inside, his certainty about everything he had believed was beginning to crack. Private First Class Robert Martinez wiped his hands on his apron and looked across the compound toward the Japanese barracks. The brisket was nearly ready, the bark dark and perfect after 14 hours of slow smoking. Ribs lined the secondary grill, their surfaces glazed with a sauce his grandmother had taught him to make. It was more food than the 30 American guards could possibly eat, and that was intentional. Captain Mitchell approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. Martinez could see the decision forming on the captain's face before he spoke. "I want you to extend an invitation," the captain said quietly. "Ask some of them to join us. Not all of them, that would be too overwhelming, but a few. The senior officers. Let them see that we're not monsters. Martinez felt his stomach tighten. Sir, with respect, they're not going to accept. Their culture, their sense of honor, it won't allow them to celebrate with us on the day their emperor surrendered. Captain Mitchell nodded slowly. I know what you're saying, Roberto. But offer anyway. Let them make the choice. Sometimes the offer itself matters more than the acceptance. Martinez walked across the compound with Corporal David Chen, a Chinese American from San Francisco, who spoke some Japanese. The language barrier had been one of the constant challenges of running the camp. Most communication happened through gestures, through the universal language of pointing and nodding. But today required actual words. They stopped at the entrance to the barracks where the Japanese officers were housed. Through the screen door, Martinez could see Lieutenant Yamamoto sitting on his bunk, his posture rigid, even in this moment of privacy. Chen knocked twice, a courtesy that surprised the Japanese officers when they looked up. Lieutenant Yamamoto, Chen said carefully in his textbook Japanese, his accent marking him as a foreigner who had learned the language in school rather than on the streets of Tokyo. Captain Mitchell requests your presence. He invites you and your senior staff to join us for a meal. It is a Texas tradition, barbecue, to mark the end of the war. The silence that followed was absolute. Takeshi stood slowly, his face unreadable. Behind him, Sergeant Nakamura and 3 other senior NCOs rose as well, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. This is a trick, Nakamura said in Japanese, assuming the Americans couldn't understand. They want to humiliate us, make us eat while they celebrate our defeat. Chen understood enough to catch the meaning. He spoke again, carefully. No trick, Lieutenant, just food. Good food. The captain believes that when the fighting stops, former enemies can sit at the same table. This is the American way. Takeshi looked at the 2 American soldiers standing in his doorway. Martinez held his gaze steadily, his posture respectful but not submissive. There was no mockery in his eyes, no cruel anticipation of watching a defeated enemy squirm. Just a simple invitation, extended between soldiers who had survived the same war from different sides. We will consider it, Takeshi said in careful English, each word chosen with precision. Thank you for the invitation. Takeshi stood at the window of the barracks, watching the American guards move around their grills with easy confidence. Behind him, his officers argued in heated whispers, their voices tight with conflict. Sergeant Nakamura was adamant. We cannot accept this invitation, Lieutenant. On the very day our emperor announces surrender, we cannot sit with our captors and share their food. It would be the ultimate dishonor. Our families would be shamed. Our ancestors would turn their faces from us. Private Sato, the youngest of the group, spoke hesitantly. But Lieutenant, isn't it also dishonorable to refuse hospitality? My grandmother taught me that to reject a sincere offer of food is to insult the giver. Nakamura turned on him sharply. Those rules apply to civilized interactions between Japanese people, not to prisoners of war eating with their conquerors. Takeshi continued to watch the Americans. Captain Mitchell was laughing at something Martinez had said, his hand resting on the younger man's shoulder in a gesture of casual affection that would have been unthinkable between a Japanese officer and his subordinate. Yet there was clearly deep respect between them, a bond that existed alongside their informal behavior. I will go, Takeshi said quietly. The arguing stopped instantly. All eyes turned to their commanding officer. Lieutenant, Nakamura began, but Takeshi raised his hand. I will go, he repeated, turning to face his men. Not to celebrate, not to befriend our captors, but to understand them. We lost this war because we did not understand our enemy. Perhaps it is time we learned why. He paused, seeing the conflict on their faces. I do not order you to accompany me. Each man must make his own choice in this matter. It is not a military decision but a personal one. The room fell silent. Takeshi could see the internal struggle in each man's expression. They had been trained their entire lives to value death over dishonor, to see capture as the ultimate failure. Yet here they were, alive, when by all traditional standards they should have chosen suicide. They had already crossed one line. Perhaps crossing another was not so impossible. Sergeant Nakamura stood slowly, his jaw tight. If the lieutenant goes, I go. Someone must ensure your safety. Private Sato stood next. I will go as well, Lieutenant. I want to understand this American food that smells like nothing I have ever known. 3 others rose, their faces showing resignation mixed with something that might have been curiosity. Takeshi straightened his uniform, such as it was after months of captivity. The fabric was worn, the insignia of rank barely visible, but he adjusted it with the same care he had given it when it was new. Gentlemen, he said formally, we go not as defeated men seeking comfort from our conquerors. We go as students seeking to understand a mystery. How did these informal, undisciplined Americans defeat the disciplined warriors of Japan? Perhaps the answer lies not in their weapons but in moments like these. With that, he walked toward the door, his small group of officers following behind him. The walk across the compound felt longer than any battlefield advance Takeshi had ever made. Each step carried the weight of decision, of crossing from one world into another. The other Japanese prisoners watched from the barracks windows, their faces pressed against the screens, silent, witnesses to what might be seen as either courage or betrayal. The smell grew stronger as they approached, and Takeshi found himself cataloging the components. Smoke, definitely, but not the acrid smoke of cooking fires he knew from Japan. This was sweeter, almost perfumed, carrying hints of wood that had burned slow and low for hours. Beneath it was the scent of meat, but transformed into something complex and layered. Captain Mitchell saw them coming and set down his beer, walking forward to meet them halfway. His gesture struck Takeshi as significant, this American officer coming to greet them rather than making them approach as supplicants. Lieutenant Yamamoto, the captain said, extending his hand, thank you for accepting our invitation. Takeshi hesitated only a moment before taking the offered hand. The handshake was firm, direct, the grip of a soldier who had seen combat. Captain Mitchell, Takeshi replied carefully, you honor us with your invitation. Martinez appeared at the captain's side, gesturing toward the massive grills. Lieutenant, I want you to meet Texas barbecue. This here is brisket. We've been smoking it since before dawn, 14 hours over oak wood. And these are ribs, pork ribs, with a dry rub and a finishing sauce. The Japanese officers stared at the quantity of meat displayed before them. In Japan, meat had been a luxury, something consumed in small portions, stretched to feed many people. Here was enough beef and pork to feed 50 men, prepared for a gathering of perhaps 40. The excess was incomprehensible. Sergeant Nakamura leaned close to Takeshi and whispered in Japanese. This is why they won. They have so much they can waste it on celebration. But Takeshi wasn't certain it was waste. The Americans had gathered around the grills not with the desperate hunger of men who rarely saw meat, but with the relaxed appreciation of people for whom food was about more than mere sustenance. It was ritual, fellowship, an expression of culture and identity. Martinez began cutting the brisket, his knife moving with practiced precision. The meat fell apart under the blade, revealing a pink smoke ring beneath the blackened crust. He placed thick slices on a plate and handed it to Takeshi. The heat rose from the meat, carrying that complex aroma directly to his face. Please, Martinez said, try it. Takeshi looked down at the plate. Steam rose from the brisket in lazy spirals. The bark glistened with rendered fat. His mouth watered involuntarily, a physical response his discipline could not entirely suppress. He was aware of every Japanese prisoner watching from the barracks windows. He knew that what he did in the next moment would be discussed, debated, perhaps condemned. But he had already crossed the compound. There was no turning back now. He picked up a piece of brisket with his fingers and brought it to his lips. The taste exploded across Takeshi's tongue with an intensity that made him close his eyes involuntarily. The meat was tender enough to fall apart without chewing, but he chewed anyway, unable to stop himself from experiencing every layer of flavor. The smoke came first, woody and deep, followed by the richness of beef fat, then unexpected notes of sweetness, pepper, and something he couldn't identify, but that made his entire mouth come alive. In his 26 years, including meals at fine restaurants in Tokyo before the war, he had never tasted anything remotely like this. He opened his eyes to find Martinez watching him with barely contained anticipation. Good? The American asked. Takeshi struggled to find words in English adequate to describe what he had just experienced. It is, he began, then paused. He tried again. I have never. The flavor is. He stopped, frustrated by the limitations of his vocabulary. Finally, he simply nodded and said, very good. Martinez's face broke into a huge grin. Wait till you try the ribs, he said, already moving toward the other grill. Behind Takeshi, Sergeant Nakamura and the other officers had received their own plates. He watched Nakamura's face as the older man took his first bite, saw the same involuntary closing of eyes, the same moment of surrender to sensation. When Nakamura looked at him, Takeshi saw something he hadn't seen in his sergeant's face since before their capture. Not quite joy, but perhaps the memory of what joy felt like. Private Sato made a small sound of pleasure that he quickly tried to suppress, his face reddening with embarrassment. But the Americans only laughed, not mockingly, but with the satisfaction of people who had shared something meaningful. Corporal Chen approached with a bowl of potato salad and another containing something red and white. Coleslaw, he explained in Japanese. And this is potato salad, American style. Very different from Japanese potato salad. He was right. The potato salad was creamy, tangy, dotted with pickles and eggs. The coleslaw had a sharp, vinegary bite that cut through the richness of the meat. Takeshi found himself eating with a focus he usually reserved for important military operations, analyzing each component while simultaneously just experiencing the pure pleasure of flavors he had never imagined could exist together. Around him, conversations were beginning to happen, halting at first, limited by language barriers and cultural uncertainty. But food provided common ground. Martinez demonstrated how to eat corn on the cob, butter dripping down his chin in a way that would have been considered crude in Japanese culture but here seemed perfectly natural. Captain Mitchell explained the different types of wood used for smoking, oak and hickory and mesquite, each imparting its own character to the meat. The Japanese officers listened, asked questions in broken English, and gradually began to relax muscles they hadn't realized were tensed. The afternoon sun beat down on the gathering, but for the first time since their capture, some of the Japanese prisoners felt something other than shame and despair. They felt, impossibly, almost welcome. The barbecue had lasted until sunset, but the questions it raised continued through the night. Takeshi lay on his bunk, unable to sleep, his mind churning with contradictions. The taste of that brisket remained in his memory, impossibly vivid. More disturbing than the flavor itself was what it represented: care, time, skill. The Americans had spent 14 hours preparing food for a celebration that included their former enemies. What kind of people did such things? Morning brought mail call, the first since the Emperor's surrender announcement. Red Cross parcels had been accumulating for weeks, delayed by the chaos of war's end. Now they arrived in bulk, canvas bags full of letters that had traveled across the Pacific, carrying news from a homeland most prisoners hadn't heard from in months. Takeshi received 3 letters, all from his younger sister, Akiko. The envelopes were dirty, creased, bearing postal marks from 6 different locations before finally reaching Texas. His hands trembled as he opened the oldest one first, dated March of 1945. Brother, Akiko had written in her careful characters. Tokyo burned last night. The American B-29s came in waves, dropping fire that spread faster than anyone could run. Our neighborhood is gone. Mother and father's house is ashes. We are staying with Aunt Fumiko in Yokohama, but nowhere feels safe anymore. Please, if you are alive, please find a way to let us know. We pray for you every day. Takeshi's vision blurred. He had known intellectually that Japan was being bombed, but reading his sister's words made it visceral, real. He opened the second letter, dated May. Brother, there is no food. The government says we must endure, but people are eating grass and tree bark. Children are dying. Father stopped going to his office because there is no office anymore. The building was destroyed in April. He sits all day and says nothing. Mother tries to remain strong, but I see her crying when she thinks no one is watching. If you can come home, please come home. We need you. The third letter was the shortest, written in a shaking hand he barely recognized as his sister's. It was dated July, just weeks before. They say there will be an invasion, that the Americans will come to the mainland and kill us all. Father has prepared poison for the family. He says it is better than what the Americans will do to us. But brother, I am only 17. I do not want to die. I do not want Mother to die. Is there truly no other way? Please, if you are reading this, if you are alive with the Americans, tell me, are they the monsters we were told about? Or were we lied to about everything? Takeshi sat motionless, his sister's letters clutched in his hands. Around him, other prisoners were reading their own mail, their faces showing similar devastation. Sergeant Nakamura looked up from a letter, tears streaming down his weathered face. My wife and daughter, he whispered. Hiroshima. They were in Hiroshima. The letter was written before whatever happened there in August. The news from home cast a shadow over the camp that no amount of Texas sunshine could penetrate. For days after the mail delivery, the Japanese prisoners moved through their routines like ghosts, their faces hollow with grief and uncertainty. Takeshi wrote and rewrote a letter to Akiko, struggling to find words that could bridge the impossible distance between her reality and his. How could he tell her that the monsters she feared had fed him the best meal of his life? That they had treated him with a dignity he had not expected? Private Martinez noticed the change immediately. The Japanese officers who had begun to open up during the barbecue had retreated back into formal silence. Lieutenant Yamamoto's face had returned to its mask of careful neutrality, revealing nothing. Martinez mentioned it to Captain Mitchell during their evening rounds. Sir, something's wrong. The mail from home, I think it hit them hard. The captain nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. What they're reading about Japan, the devastation, the starvation, and here we are, feeding them 3 meals a day, giving them medical care, treating them better than their own country could right now. That night Martinez made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't predict. He gathered his personal belongings, including care packages his family had sent from San Antonio, and walked across the compound to the Japanese officers' barracks. He knocked on the doorframe, waiting for permission to enter. Takeshi appeared, his expression wary. Private Martinez. Is there a problem? No problem, Lieutenant. Martinez held up the packages. My family sends me stuff I don't need. Chocolate, cigarettes, soap, socks. I thought maybe you and your men could use some of it. Takeshi stared at the packages, confusion evident in his eyes. Why would you give these to us? Martinez shrugged, suddenly feeling awkward. Because you're reading letters about your family's starving, and I've got 5 pounds of chocolate I don't need. Seems wrong to keep it when... He trailed off. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Takeshi spoke quietly. We are your enemies. We were trying to kill your countrymen months ago. Martinez met his gaze steadily. Yeah, and months ago, I was trying to kill yours. But the war's over now, Lieutenant. And you're not in Japan starving, you're here, and I've got chocolate I don't need. Takeshi reached out slowly and accepted the packages, his hands careful, as if the items might burn him. Thank you, Private Martinez. This is... He paused, searching for words. This is not what we were taught to expect from Americans. Martinez smiled sadly. I figure maybe a lot of what both sides were taught turned out to be wrong. The next morning, other American guards began following Martinez's example. Corporal Chen brought books in English and Japanese that he had collected. Sergeant Williams contributed extra blankets as autumn began to chill the Texas nights. Private Johnson, whose mother was a seamstress, offered to repair torn uniforms without being asked. Each gesture was small, almost insignificant on its own, but together they created something the Japanese prisoners had no framework to understand. October brought cooler weather to Central Texas, and with it, an unexpected request from Captain Mitchell. He had acquired a portable radio and wondered if the Japanese prisoners might enjoy music in the evenings. Takeshi, when approached with the offer, was deeply suspicious. What kind of music? He asked carefully. The captain shrugged. Whatever you want. We've got classical, jazz, some country western. Thought it might make the evenings less monotonous. The first evening of music began tentatively. The Americans set up the radio in a neutral area between the two sections of the camp, where both guards and prisoners could gather if they chose. Most of the Japanese prisoners stayed in their barracks initially, uncertain about this new development, but curiosity eventually drew them out in small groups. The music that first played was something the Americans called swing. The rhythm was complex, syncopated, completely unlike traditional Japanese music. But there was something infectious about it, something that made even stern Sergeant Nakamura's foot tap involuntarily against the ground. Private Sato, the youngest of the prisoners, watched the American guards with fascination. Some of them were dancing, if it could be called that, moving with an unself-conscious freedom that would have been scandalous in Japan. Women and men dancing together, touching, spinning, laughing when they made mistakes. Martinez noticed Sato's attention and walked over with a grin. "Want to learn?" he asked, his hands miming dance movements. Sato's eyes widened with alarm, but also with unmistakable interest. "I cannot dance," he said in careful English. "I never learned." Martinez laughed. "Neither could I until my sisters forced me. It's easy. Watch." He demonstrated basic steps, exaggerating his movements for clarity. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just follow the beat. To everyone's surprise, Corporal Chen joined in, his movements more practiced than Martinez's. "Before the war, I danced in San Francisco," he explained in Japanese to the watching prisoners. "Music doesn't know about war or sides, it's just music." Slowly, impossibly, some of the younger Japanese prisoners began to try the steps, their movements stiff and self-conscious at first. But the music was relentless, infectious, and gradually they began to loosen up. Takeshi watched from the edge of the gathering, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, but Sergeant Nakamura surprised him by walking over and speaking quietly. "Lieutenant, when did we forget how to be young?" "We are soldiers," Takeshi replied automatically. "We have duties," Nakamura nodded slowly. "Yes. But the war is over. Our emperor has surrendered. Perhaps our duty now is to learn how to be something other than soldiers." The older sergeant paused, then added, "My daughter's last letter said she remembered me laughing. She asked if I would ever laugh again. I could not answer her because I did not know." That night, as American swing music filled the Texas air, something shifted in the camp. Not dramatically, not with grand pronouncements or formal declarations, but in small ways. A smile here, a moment of shared rhythm there, the beginning of something that looked almost like joy, emerging from the ruins of everything they thought they knew. November brought the first serious discussions about repatriation. American officials began processing paperwork, arranging transportation, preparing for the massive undertaking of returning thousands of Japanese prisoners to their homeland. But in the barracks at Camp Hood, those discussions sparked unexpected anxiety among the men who had spent months dreaming of returning to Japan. Late one evening, Private Sato approached Takeshi with a question that had clearly been tormenting him. "Lieutenant, may I speak freely?" Takeshi looked up from the letter he was writing to Akiko. "Of course." Sato sat down on the adjacent bunk, his young face troubled. "I have been thinking about going home, about what waits for me there. My family's farm was in the path of the American advance. I do not know if it still exists. I do not know if my parents are alive. The last letter I received was from February, 10 months ago." He paused, struggling with words. "Here, I know what each day will bring. I have food, I have shelter, I am learning English. Private Martinez is teaching me about farming techniques from America. What will I return to?" Takeshi set down his pen carefully. "We will return to Japan because it is our home. Because our families need us to help rebuild. Even if everything is destroyed, we are still Japanese. Our place is there." But Sato was not deterred. "Are we still Japanese, Lieutenant? We have been changed by what we learned here. When we speak of these Americans with respect, when we admit that they showed us kindness, will we be welcomed in Japan? Or will we be seen as corrupted, contaminated by enemy influence?" The question hung in the air because Takeshi had no answer. He had been wrestling with the same thoughts himself. His letters to Akiko had become increasingly difficult to write. How could he explain that his captors had become something other than enemies, that he had eaten their food, learned their language, and begun to see them as individuals rather than as a faceless opposing force? The conversation with Sato sparked others. Within days, small groups of prisoners were discussing the same questions in hushed voices. Sergeant Nakamura confessed his fear that he would not recognize his wife after years of separation, that the war had changed him too, fundamentally. Others worried about being labeled as traitors for having survived capture when so many had chosen death. The shame of survival, temporarily forgotten during barbecues and music evenings, returned with crushing weight. Captain Mitchell, observing these discussions from a distance, called Takeshi to his office in mid-November. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that repatriation is not mandatory. Any prisoner who has legitimate concerns about returning to Japan can request Yensi delay." Takeshi stiffened. "Captain, we are prisoners of war. We have no choice but to return when ordered." Mitchell leaned back in his chair. "Actually, you do. The war crimes trials are ongoing. We need translators, cultural advisors, people who understand both Japanese and American perspectives. Some of your men have skills we need. If they choose to stay and work with us, that can be arranged." The offer was staggering in its implications. Stay in America? Work with the occupation forces? It would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by many in Japan. Captain Mitchell announced that there would be one last barbecue before the repatriation process began in earnest. This time, he invited all 217 Japanese prisoners, not just the officers. The guards would prepare enough food for everyone, a final gesture of goodwill before the men returned to whatever awaited them in Japan. The announcement created ripples of conversation throughout the camp. Some prisoners remained adamant that attending would be dishonorable. Others, having heard stories from those who had attended the first barbecue, were cautiously curious. But most simply wanted one more experience of abundance before returning to a country where, according to every letter they received, starvation was the norm. The preparation began 3 days before the event. Martinez recruited Takeshi and several other Japanese prisoners to help with the smoking process, teaching them the techniques his family had perfected over generations. "You start with the rub," Martinez explained, demonstrating how to massage the mixture of salt, pepper, paprika, and secret spices into the meat. "Then it goes on the smoker for 12 to 14 hours. Low and slow. That's the key. Never rush good barbecue." Takeshi found himself fascinated by the precision required, the careful attention to temperature and timing. It reminded him of the discipline required in martial arts, the same focus on fundamentals executed perfectly. Private Sato, working alongside them, asked through Corporal Chen's translation, "Could this be done in Japan? Could we teach this method there?" Martinez paused, considering. "Sure, why not? Might need different wood, different seasonings to match Japanese tastes. But the basic technique, that works anywhere you got fire and patience." The idea took root immediately. Several prisoners began discussing the possibility of bringing American barbecue techniques back to Japan, adapting them to local ingredients and preferences. It was the first time Takeshi had heard his men speak about the future, with something approaching enthusiasm rather than dread. The day of the barbecue arrived clear and warm, unusual for late November. The Americans had outdone themselves. 6 massive grills were loaded with brisket, ribs, chicken, and sausages. Tables groaned under the weight of side dishes, potato salad, coleslaw, beans, cornbread, and pickles. There was even a barrel of cold lemonade, a luxury none of the prisoners had tasted in years. As the Japanese prisoners filed into the designated area, Takeshi watched their faces carefully. Most showed cautious wonder at the quantity of food. Some remained stone-faced, their resistance to this display of American generosity still intact. But the younger men, especially those who had been attending the evening music sessions, approached with barely concealed eagerness. Captain Mitchell raised his voice to address the gathered crowd, with Corporal Chen translating. "Gentlemen, the war between our countries is over. What comes next is up to all of us. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. This meal is offered in the hope that someday, Americans and Japanese can remember that before we were enemies, we were all just men. And maybe, someday, we can be friends." The barbecue transformed into something none of the organizers had anticipated. As the sun set over Camp Hood, 217 Japanese prisoners and 30 American guards sat together in small mixed groups, sharing food and attempting conversation despite language barriers. Hands gestured wildly to compensate for missing words. Drawings were sketched in the dirt to explain concepts. Laughter erupted when misunderstandings led to absurd conclusions. It was messy, chaotic, and profoundly human. Takeshi sat with Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Nakamura, and Private Martinez, picking meat off a rib with his fingers in a way that would have horrified his mother. The captain was explaining the history of Texas barbecue, how different regions developed different styles, how families guarded their recipes like military secrets. Martinez was teaching them the proper way to eat brisket, separating the lean from the fatty point, savoring each distinct texture. Sergeant Nakamura, 3 months earlier the strictest enforcer of military discipline, was laughing at his own clumsy attempts to explain Japanese cuisine using only hand gestures and broken English. Private Sato approached the group, his face flushed with emotion and perhaps the beer that Captain Mitchell had quietly allowed for the occasion. "Lieutenant," he said in Japanese, "I have made a decision. I wish to request delay of repatriation. Private Martinez has offered to help me find work on a farm in Texas. He says I can learn American farming methods and eventually return to Japan to help rebuild our agriculture." Takeshi felt his chest tighten. "Sato, this is not a decision to make lightly. Your family. Your honor." Sato nodded vigorously. "I know, Lieutenant, but my family needs food more than they need my presence. If I can learn techniques that will help Japan feed itself, is that not also a form of service? Is that not also honor?" Before Takeshi could respond, Corporal Yoshi Tanaka, a 28-year-old from Kyoto, spoke up from a nearby group. "I wish to stay as well, Lieutenant. Captain Mitchell says the occupation forces need translators. I can help ensure that American policies are implemented fairly, that Japanese civilians are treated with respect. Is that not worth more than returning home in shame?" The murmurs spread through the gathering. Other prisoners began voicing similar thoughts, plans they had been forming quietly over the past weeks. Some wanted to delay repatriation to work, to learn, to acquire skills that could help rebuild Japan. Others simply could not face returning to families they had not heard from in months, to homes that might no longer exist. Sergeant Nakamura looked at Takeshi with an expression that mixed understanding with profound sadness. "Lieutenant, these men look to you for guidance. What will you tell them?" Takeshi gazed across the gathering, seeing Japanese and American soldiers sitting together, sharing food and fumbling toward friendship. He thought of Akiko's letters, of her questions about whether Americans were truly monsters. He thought of the brisket that had opened his eyes to how wrong his assumptions had been. Finally, he spoke. "I will tell them that honor is not found in dying for a lost cause. Honor is found in living to build something better." December 15, 1945. The day of repatriation arrived with an unusual chill in the Texas air. Of the 217 Japanese prisoners who had called Camp Hood home for the past 7 months, 183 were preparing to board trains for California, then ships for Japan. 34 had requested delays, accepting positions as translators, agricultural workers, or assistants to the occupation administration. The decision had split the camp in ways that went deeper than simple logistics. Some of those returning viewed the men who stayed as traitors, their choice to remain with their captors an unforgivable betrayal. Others understood but carried their own guilt about leaving comrades behind. The emotional complexity of the morning defied easy categorization. In the barracks, men who had shared space for months said farewell with stiff formality, unable to articulate feelings too complicated for words. Takeshi had chosen to return. The decision had not been easy, but his sister's letters had made it clear that his family needed him. His father's spirit was broken, his mother exhausted from keeping the household together, and Akiko was still just 17, too young to bear such burdens alone. But he had written to them about the Americans, carefully, knowing the letters would be censored, but wanting to plant seeds of understanding. Private Sato stood before him, tears streaming unashamedly down his young face. "Lieutenant, I feel I am abandoning you." Takeshi placed his hand on Sato's shoulder. "You are not abandoning anyone. You are serving Japan in a different way. Learn everything you can here. Then, when you do return, bring that knowledge home. That is an order." Sato bowed deeply, the formal bow of a student to a master. "Hi, Lieutenant-san. I will not fail you." The Japanese prisoners who were leaving gathered in formation one last time, their belongings packed in canvas bags provided by the Americans. Captain Mitchell inspected the formation, not as a captor reviewing prisoners, but as a commanding officer bidding farewell to soldiers. "Gentlemen," he said, with Corporal Chen translating, "you came here as our enemies. You leave as men we have come to respect. I hope you will carry with you the knowledge that Americans do not hate the Japanese people. We fought a war against your government's actions, not against you as individuals. Whatever you find when you return home, please remember that there are Americans who wish you well, who hope for your country's recovery, and who believe that our two nations need never be enemies again." Sergeant Nakamura, representing the departing prisoners, stepped forward. "Captain Mitchell," he said in careful English, words he had practiced for days, "we came here expecting cruelty. You gave us kindness. We expected hatred. You gave us respect. We expected punishment. You gave us hope. We will not forget this. We will tell our families, our children, our grandchildren. Not all wounds from war need to remain forever." The formation began to move toward the waiting trucks. As Takeshi walked past the area where they had shared barbecue just weeks earlier, he saw Martinez standing at attention, saluting. Takeshi stopped and returned the salute with precision, then did something unprecedented. He extended his hand. Martinez took Takeshi's hand without hesitation, their grip firm and equal. The younger man's eyes were bright with emotion. "Lieutenant, stay safe over there, and if you ever make it back to Texas, you know where to find me. San Antonio. My family would be honored to have you." Takeshi nodded, not trusting his voice. Then Martinez did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Takeshi. "My grandmother's barbecue sauce recipe," he said quietly, "and the rub we use for brisket. I wrote it all down, with drawings so you'd remember. Maybe someday you can share it with your family." Takeshi unfolded the paper carefully. Martinez had drawn detailed illustrations of the smoking process, labeled in both English and phonetic Japanese, that Corporal Chen had clearly helped translate. The measurements were converted to Japanese standards. The instructions were meticulous. It was the recipe of someone who wanted to be remembered, who wanted a connection to survive distance and time. "This is," Takeshi began, his English failing him. He switched to Japanese, trusting Chen to translate. "This is a gift I do not deserve but will treasure. Thank you, my friend." The word hung in the air. Friend. Neither man had intended to use it, yet there it was, acknowledging what had grown between former enemies over months of unexpected kindness. The trucks departed Camp Hood in a convoy, dust rising behind them like smoke. Takeshi watched through the rear window as the camp grew smaller, as the men who had chosen to stay waved farewell, as Private Sato stood between Martinez and Captain Mitchell, already becoming part of a new family. The journey to San Francisco took 3 days. The ship voyage to Japan took 2 weeks. When Takeshi finally stepped onto Japanese soil in early January of 1946, he was shocked by what he saw. The Japan he remembered was gone. In its place was a landscape of ruins, ash, and desperate people. Yokohama's port area was devastated, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets filled with rubble and makeshift shelters. People moved like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger, their eyes empty of hope. American occupation forces were everywhere, and Takeshi watched his fellow returning prisoners tense with shame and resentment at seeing foreign soldiers on Japanese soil. But Takeshi observed something else. He saw American soldiers distributing food to children. He saw medical teams treating wounded civilians. He saw, despite the obvious tension and mutual suspicion, efforts at reconstruction rather than revenge. His family's reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. Akiko had grown thin, her 17-year-old face marked by experiences no child should endure. His mother wept while trying to maintain composure. His father looked decades older than his 53 years, his spirit visibly broken by defeat. That first night, gathered around a meager meal of rice and pickled vegetables, Takeshi told them about Texas, about Captain Mitchell and Private Martinez, about barbecue that took 14 hours to prepare, about Americans who had shown him that enemies could become something else. His father listened in silence, his face unreadable. 23 years later, in the autumn of 1968, Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the doorway of his restaurant in Tokyo's Shibuya district, watching customers line up for tables. The sign above the door read Texas Smokehouse in both Japanese and English, and the smell that drifted from the kitchen was unmistakable. Slow smoked brisket, prepared exactly as Private Martinez had taught him decades earlier. It had taken years to perfect the technique using Japanese equipment and locally sourced wood. It had taken even longer to convince Japanese customers that this strange American food was worth trying. But Takeshi had persisted, driven by a promise he had made to himself during those dark early days of occupation. He would prove that even from the ashes of war, something new and good could grow. His daughter Yuki, now 20 years old, worked the dining room with practiced efficiency. She had grown up listening to her father's stories about Texas, about kindness shown when cruelty was expected, about Americans who had changed his understanding of what enemies could become. She had never known the Japan that existed before the war, only the one that rebuilt itself with stubborn determination. "Father," she called out in English, switching languages effortlessly. "There's a call for you from America, long distance." Takeshi's heart quickened as he picked up the phone. The connection was scratchy, traveling across the Pacific Ocean through cables laid on the seafloor. "Hello? This is Yamamoto. Lieutenant?" The voice was older, rougher, but instantly recognizable. "It's Roberto Martinez." Takeshi's hand tightened on the phone, emotion closing his throat. "Martinez. My friend. After all, these years." "I got your letter about the restaurant," Martinez continued, "about how you've been teaching Japanese people about Texas barbecue. I showed it to the captain, well, Colonel Mitchell now, retired. We were wondering if you'd want some visitors. Thought maybe we could finally take you up on that offer to show us Japan." 3 weeks later, Takeshi stood at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, watching passengers emerge from a Pan Am flight from Los Angeles. He spotted them immediately. Martinez, now 45 years old, his hair graying at the temples but his smile unchanged. Colonel Mitchell, dignified in civilian clothes, walking with a slight limp from an old injury, and between them, to Takeshi's shock, Private Kenji Sato, who had stayed in Texas 23 years earlier. Sato had returned to Japan 5 years ago, bringing with him an American wife and agricultural techniques that had helped revitalize farming in his home prefecture. The reunion was emotional beyond words. 4 men who had last stood together in a Texas prisoner of war camp now stood in a rebuilt Tokyo, representatives of nations that had moved from bitter enemies to close allies. That evening, Takeshi's restaurant was closed to regular customers. Instead, it hosted a private gathering of former prisoners and guards, their families, and friends. The dining room filled with the aroma of smoking brisket, with conversations in mixed English and Japanese, with laughter that transcended language barriers. Martinez stood to offer a toast, his words translated by Yuki for those who needed it. 23 years ago, we tried to kill each other. Tonight, we share food that took 14 hours to prepare. That's not just peace. That's family." Takeshi raised his glass, his eyes bright with tears. "We discovered in Texas that the best victory over hatred is not to kill your enemy but to make him your friend."